On today's episode of Women That Kill, we examine Giulia Tofana, whose name became feared across Europe for her deadly poison. For nearly 50 years, this Italian professional poisoner sold a lethal concoction to women desperate for escape. Her partners included her daughter and a network of trusted associates. Their crimes spanned Sicily, Naples, and Rome throughout the 1600s. This story grows even more complex as we enter the realm where history and legend blend, making it difficult to distinguish fact from legend. Information about Giulia Tofana's background is sparse and contested. For a long time, the most widely accepted account held that she was born in Palermo, Sicily, and that she may have been the daughter of another Palermo poisoner named Teofania Adamo, a woman who was executed on July 12, 1633, for killing her own husband. The theory went that Giulia had adopted her mother's first name as her own last name, a practice not uncommon at the time, and that the recipe for Aqua Tofana had been passed down from mother to daughter as a dark inheritance. But more recent scholarship has significantly complicated that picture. Historian Craig A. Monson, in his 2020 book, The Black Widows of the Eternal City, published by the University of Michigan Press, argues based on archival research that the woman we know as Giulia Tofana was actually born in Corleone, Sicily in 1581, under the name Giulia Mangiardi. Monson finds no evidence that she was related to Teofania Adamo at all, suggesting that the mother-daughter origin story may be more myth than fact. What is certain? Inherited or developed, Giulia Tofana mastered poison chemistry. Intelligent, methodical, and moving in a world where women had little power, she excelled. To truly understand Giulia Tofana, you have to understand what it meant to be a woman in 17th century Italy. This was a world in which men held almost unlimited legal and social authority over the women in their lives. A woman's father owned her until she married. Her husband owned her after that. She had no meaningful standing in court, no right to property in most circumstances, and almost no recourse if her husband was cruel, abusive, or simply impossible to live with. Divorce was not an option in Catholic Italy. Separation was rare and carried an enormous social stigma. A woman who left her husband faced poverty, exclusion, and condemnation. The options available to women were brutally limited. You could marry and hope your husband treated you decently. You could remain unmarried and rely on whatever work you could find, which for many women meant sex work. Or you could become a widow. For many, widowhood was the only path to freedom. A widow could own property, make decisions, and breathe, within walls built to hold them in. Giulia Tofana's enterprise emerges as a dark solution, one that fit the twisted logic of her time, offering a desperate kind of hope in exchange for secrecy and risk. Italy, in this era, was also a place where poison had developed its own quiet economy. Poisons were so commonly used for inheritance purposes that they had earned a grim nickname: inheritance powders. The wealthy used them to accelerate the transfer of estates. The desperate used them to escape impossible situations. And the women who sold them occupied a shadowy but very real place in the social fabric of the time. Aqua Tofana made Giulia infamous. By the era's standards, it was nearly the perfect weapon. Aqua Tofana was a clear, odorless liquid, colorless and tasteless. 4 to 6 drops reportedly killed. Its main ingredient was arsenic, likely mixed with other compounds. Aqua Tofana acted slowly. Victims did not collapse or show clear signs of poisoning. Instead, they declined gradually, with symptoms resembling natural illness. At the time, post-mortem analysts could not detect it. But the slow action of Aqua Tofana served another purpose beyond avoiding detection, one that speaks directly to the deeply Catholic world in which Giulia operated. Because the poison worked gradually, a dying husband had time to put his affairs in order. He had time to confess his sins. He had time to receive the last rites and make his peace with God. His soul, in the theology of the time, could still be saved. His killer did not need to carry the weight of having damned him. In a twisted dance between mercy and murder, Aqua Tofana offered a gentler death, cruel in its purpose but cloaked in a chilling compassion. Giulia sold poison only to women she knew, or those vouched for by past clients. Her network ran on trust, secrecy, and desperation. She moved from Sicily to Naples and then to Rome, expanding her operation. With her daughter, associates, and possibly a sympathetic priest, she created a support network for women trapped in impossible lives. The influence of Giulia Tofana's poison extended far beyond the streets of Rome. In 17th century France, the scandal known as the Affair of the Poisons rocked the court of King Louis XIV, and the networks and methods that fueled it bore unmistakable similarities to Giulia's operation. The rise of Lavoisin, the French poisoner who allegedly plotted against the Sun King himself, drew on a tradition of female poisoning networks that Giulia had helped establish. There is also the Mozart connection. On his deathbed in 1791, Mozart reportedly said, "I am sure that I have been poisoned. Someone has given me Aqua Tofana." Whether he was poisoned is unknown, but the fact that he named Aqua Tofana more than a century after Giulia's death shows how deeply her creation haunted Europe. For almost 50 years, Giulia's operation was efficient. The poison was undetectable. The deaths raised no suspicion. Her clients got what they needed, and among them, Giulia was a helper, not a villain. Yet, as with all grand secrets, a single moment of fear can topple even the most carefully laid plans, unraveling years of shadowed work in a single, breathless instant. One of Giulia's clients, a young woman who had obtained Aqua Tofana with the intention of poisoning her husband, lost her nerve at the critical moment. She had already added the poison to his soup. Then, overcome with fear, guilt, or both, she begged him not to eat it. Her husband, understandably alarmed, pressed her until she revealed everything: the poison, the poisoner, the network. He went to the authorities. Giulia learned about her arrest warrant before police arrived and sought sanctuary in a local church, a protection the Catholic Church allowed. But a rumor spread that Giulia had poisoned Rome's water. The sanctuary became insufficient. Authorities arrested her. Whether the rumor was deliberately planted by authorities to turn public opinion against her, or simply the product of mass panic, it worked. The sanctuary that had protected her was no longer enough. Authorities moved in and apprehended her. Under torture, Giulia confessed to facilitating over 600 deaths in Rome between 1633 and 1651. Historians doubt this number, as confessions under torture are unreliable and the real figure may differ. Giulia's motive was not hatred or greed, but something more unsettling. She believed she provided a lifeline to women with no other way out. Accounts say she felt for women in trapped marriages and gave them an exit in a world with no legal recourse. That does not excuse the deaths of hundreds of men, many of whom may have been guilty of nothing more than being inconvenient to their wives. but it does place Giulia Tofana in a historical context far more complex than a simple story of a murderer for hire. She was a product of her world, and her world gave women almost nothing to work with. The fate of Giulia Tofana after her capture lingers in history like the echo of a whispered legend. Her final chapter lost in time, her story growing only more haunting in the retelling. It is widely believed that she was executed in Rome's Campo de' Fiori in 1659, along with her daughter and several of her closest associates. Dozens of lower class women who had been her customers were also executed. Many upper class women, whose social position afforded them more protection, were imprisoned or banished rather than killed. But other accounts tell entirely different stories. One source claims she died peacefully of natural causes in 1651, with no one ever aware of her activities. Another says she found sanctuary in a convent and lived on for years, continuing to produce her poison, distributing it through a network of nuns and clergy. The dates given for her execution vary wildly across different historical sources. 1659, 1709, and even 1730 have all been proposed. One particularly vivid account describes her being dragged from her sanctuary and strangled, after which her body was thrown back into the grounds of the convent from which she had been taken. The truth, like Aqua Tofana itself, has proven almost impossible to pin down. At the end of every episode, if I can find the killer's birthday, I take a look at their zodiac sign, because it gives us an interesting lens through which to view who they were. Giulia Tofana's birth date, like so much else about her life, has not been definitively preserved. If the historian Craig Monson is correct that she was born in 1581, she lived to be somewhere between 70 and 150 years old, depending on which account of her death you believe, which itself tells you something about how legend has overtaken fact in her story. Because we don't have a confirmed birth date, we won't be looking at her zodiac sign. But what we can say is this: whatever her sign, Giulia Tofana was patient, methodical, deeply perceptive about human nature, and capable of operating in the shadows for nearly half a century without being caught. She read people, she built networks, she survived in a world that gave women almost no tools for survival. That is a remarkable profile, whatever the stars say. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to learn more about women in crime, check out my playlist. There are plenty more stories waiting for you.